Thank you for joining our presentation today on changing the conversation on chronic illness and disability. This presentation is being live streamed on YouTube and recorded for future viewing. My name is Molly Stroll. I'm with the One Lambda marketing team and the LA chapter of the Thermo Fisher Scientific Women's Employee Resource Group. This event is sponsored by the Women's Employee Resource Group as part of Thermo Fisher's efforts to foster a diverse team and an inclusive culture where differences are truly valued, where all voices are heard, and where we can do our best work in order to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing Patricia Hoekman, who will be the moderator for our presentation. Patricia is a senior IP litigation paralegal with Thermo Fisher Scientific, and she is the co-lead of the possAbilities Employee Resource Group based in Carlsbad, California. During her time at Thermo Fisher Scientific, Patricia's personal experience with chronic illness and disability has led her to advocate for disability access, help drive the recruitment of candidates who identify as disabled, and create educational programming on a variety of topics, including the intersectionality of disability, mental health support, and unconscious bias. This is an open discussion, and we thank those of you who pre-submitted questions. We encourage you to ask questions during the discussion as well. You can do so by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and then typing your questions into the open field. For those of you watching the live stream, please type your questions into the chat. Questions will be answered throughout the presentation. It's now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Patricia, who will share a little bit more about her background and begin the discussion with our guest speakers. Patricia?
Thank you, Molly. And I wanted to welcome Erik Runnels. Can you give us a little wave so we know which one to pick? And then Gabe, how about you? This is Gabe Forbes. Thank you, both of you, for being with us today. Before I tell you about Erik and Gabe, let me just give you a little bit of information on myself. I've been working with Thermo Fisher Scientific for 10 years now. And as Molly said, I am an IP litigation paralegal with the company. And I also am the founder of the Carlsbad chapter of possAbilities ERG and one of the current co-leads. So the possAbilities Employee Resource Group is an affinity group that is geared around inclusivity for people with differing abilities, advocates, partners, people that are just interested in those particular topics. And we have chapters all across Thermo Fisher and globally as well. One of our biggest mission statements is trying to help drive the impact to the business through creating an inclusive and diverse culture for our colleagues with differing abilities at the company. We are focused on a variety of issues, particularly in Carlsbad, as Molly said, with working on doing some specific disability recruiting initiatives, neurodiversity hiring pilot that the company has been working on for the last couple of years, and also a great push for mental health support, which I think has been very, very important during this pandemic. Personally, I've become very interested in these issues since I, in 2014, was a Bell's palsy survivor, I guess you could say. My Bell's palsy never fully resolved, and it's left me with a chronic disability with partial facial paralysis and some chronic migraines. I mean, every day I have a migraine. Some days they're really, really bad, and other days, you know, they're just a dull roar. But that kind of dealing with that chronic illness as an adult and trying to find a way to sort of put my life back together has been really important to me, and looking at disability advocacy, and has brought me to the possAbilities ERG at Thermo Fisher. So let me tell you a little bit about our panelists today. Erik Runnels has an amazing career in spite of everything that he's gone through. He was diagnosed at the age of 5 with Focal Segmental Glomeruli Sclerosis, also known as FSGS, And this is a chronic kidney disease that has resulted in Erik being a 4-time kidney transplant recipient and the longest ever survivor of FSGS. Erik, as I said, has had a great career. He's dabbled in some television writing and storytelling, and now he has launched a career in law and is a practicing patent attorney living in the LA area. Gabe Forbes is the second child in a family of 8, and along with 3 of his brothers, has been diagnosed with hemophilia since birth. And Gabe, in spite of this, has been a lifelong athlete and chess player, has authored multiple journal articles in medical periodicals, and is now in his first year of medical school at Case Western in Cleveland, Ohio. So welcome, Erik and Gabe. And how did Erik and Gabe get together? They told me this really great story about Gabe's brother, who was working in a coffee shop in the LA area. And Erik was there and had become friends with Gabe's brother. And Gabe came in to pick up his brother one day. And then they started talking and had this 3-hour conversation about a very interesting medical advance that was going on for people with anemia. And they discovered they had a shared passion for disability advocacy. And how does chronic illness impact the lives of people? So resulting from that, they have been working on launching a podcast called This Sick Life. It's going to be going live in the next few weeks, hopefully before the end of January 2021. And in the podcast, they're going to be exploring topics that surround living with chronic illness, interviewing doctors, patients, parents, politicians, Pulitzer Prize winners, religious leaders, and even Hollywood producers. So I think that today's live stream and panel is going to give us a little preview about what we can experience in their upcoming podcast. So thank you, Erik, and thank you, Gabe, for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
I'm just going to go ahead and launch into some of the questions that we've gotten regarding what it's like to live with chronic illness. Before I start, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity if you have something to say and tell us a little about yourself. Erik, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I mean, you covered a lot of it in that introduction. The only other things I would add is that it's funny when you talk about how I met Gabe, and that just sounds incredibly nerdy. 2 guys in a coffee shop. Hey, have you heard about this synthetic genetic drug? Now that I think about it, wow, that was a pretty nerdy meeting, Gabe. but yeah, I think you covered everything for purposes of this podcast that is going to go into it. The only other thing that I would add is one of the things that we bonded over is both Gabe and I come from, actually it's families of 6. Both of us have 5 brothers and sisters, and it's the same breakdown. We both have the same number of brothers and the same number of sisters. So other than that, though, I think you did a good job of covering pretty much everything that would be relevant for purposes of this podcast. I'm sorry, this program. I'm so used to saying podcast now.
Yeah, just to echo Erik, I thought it was a great introduction, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Great. Well, thank you. Let's just jump right in then. As I mentioned in our introduction, you have both been diagnosed with your chronic illnesses from either a very young age or from birth. And let's talk about that childhood experience. Why don't you tell me, Erik, a little bit about what sort of medical care your illness required when you were a child? I mean, 4 kidney transplants, this must have started very early for you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question for anyone. And I would imagine for anyone who's like in the scientific community, because the advances that I've seen, that I've lived through are highly profound. I mean, by the time I was about 15, every other single person that I knew growing up had died. So the differences in technology now, and it's not a death sentence right now, like it was when I was a kid. When I was thinking about this question, there were a few specific things that I thought I'd mention about being sick as a kid that have changed in terms of care. So obviously, when your kidneys failed, and this is true to this day, you're on dialysis. But dialysis today, while the technology is similar, there's been a lot of studies around it that have changed how they treat you. So one of the things that was true when I was a kid was that the diet was pretty profound. You weren't allowed salt. You weren't allowed, you could have about, I don't know if the camera can see this, about twice that much liquid in a day. So like if you had a popsicle, you had to record that. You could have no phosphorus. You could have no potassium. All of these things would either kill you or rot your bones. So, you know, you would go to a birthday party and you wouldn't eat the cake. It was too salty, and you couldn't have the Kool-Aid. It was too much liquid, and you couldn't have the pizza that they had afterwards that had too much phosphorus, too much salt. And sort of as a way to show what this was like, I was thinking of, you know, how did this impact me as a kid? What's the story I can come up with? And when I was in I guess it's this fourth grade, I don't even know how old you are there, but fourth grade, probably about 11 or so, there was a overnight camp. And I had been doing this diet for about 3 to 4 years at that point. And I went on this camp, and one of the things that happened back then was you were extremely tired all the time, and you were just very weak. And so the kids go on a hike, and I go on this hike with the kids, and they go up the mountain, and it gets to the top of the mountain, not the mountain, the hill. And you get to the top, I got to the top of the hill, and I thought to myself, you know, I couldn't go on. So they sent me back to camp. And at camp, these kids were going to go on the hike and circle back around. And at the end, they were going to eat lunch. And it was a typical like fourth grader lunch. There were these tables set out, and all these moms who didn't know who I was are sort of setting up lunch. And it was like bologna and bread and mustard and potato chips and the cheapest, awfulest food that no one is going to be excited about. And I remember standing there and something just snapped. And I remember looking at this table and thinking, you know, just kind of like, oh, like angels from above, and thinking, I need this food. And somehow, even before anyone who knew me got back, I had downed about 15 bologna sandwiches and something like 10 glasses of Kool-Aid. And I had to leave camp later that day just because I had dialysis. And I remember being home that night, it was after dialysis, and just going through every bite in my head and thinking, you know, bite 46, oh, that's an amazing, I had the bologna. And then I was having trouble breathing. And then it started to feel like someone sitting on my chest. And I remember ignoring it, just reliving these bites. And I couldn't avoid, you know, like I couldn't breathe. And so I went down to tell my parents. They rushed me to the hospital, and it turns out I had congestive heart failure. And that's the kind of thing that you could get back then from one slip up. And they had to pump, I almost died. They had to pump my stomach and everything. It's the only slip up I made in my entire childhood, but one slip up meant death. So that was the diet. You don't have to do that anymore. Now there's medicines that pretty much, for the most part, except for the liquid, but you don't have to be as strict with the liquid, control everything. So that's all gone. Another thing is, and this is what me and Gabe had bonded over that they were talking about at the beginning. Another thing is that you had anemia, profound anemia, and about once a month you needed a transfusion so you could move. And this is right as AIDS is being discovered. And another story that I remember is one day I was on the way to the hospital to get this transfusion, and I got sick or something in the car. It's so long ago, I can't remember exactly what happened, but for whatever reason, we called the hospital up and asked if we could postpone it for a day. And so they said, sure, there's another girl who's scheduled tomorrow to have a transfusion. She has your blood type, and we're just going to shift transfusions, and she'll take yours today and you'll do hers tomorrow. About 3 months later, we found out she got AIDS from that blood transfusion.
Oh, wow.
So that's another thing that we started living with, is all of these blood transfusions. And about half the kids that I was in dialysis with died of AIDS ultimately. And it was particularly rough because this was the beginning of AIDS, and there was a lot of prejudice about it. And us kids would go and watch the news stories, and you would see there was some kid named Ryan White, I think it was his name, and he was getting stoned, little kid who had AIDS, and people were throwing rocks at him and everything. And we knew this was coming down. Any of us could get this at any time. And that was a big difference. Now anemia is not a problem. There's this thing called erythropoietin, which is a synthetic hormone that they can give you. That's another big difference. There's so much more now in the realm of trying to acclimate, if you're a kid, acclimate you to school and figure out how to get to school. So there were just a profound number of differences. Transplants, there was no immune suppressants. There was prednisone. If anyone knows anything about drug, all you had was prednisone. If you had a transplant, the first transplant I got was when I was in 8th grade. I was in the hospital for 3 months. The last transplant I got, I was in the hospital for 2 days. They used to, if you were a donor, they used to take the kidney out of your back. So that was a lot longer recovery period. Now they can take it. Last time I had a living donor, they took it out of her front. She was up and out of the hospital in about a day or 2. That's a huge change. There's now immunosuppressants that exist that didn't exist when I was a kid. So there's tons and tons of advances, but the upshot is that it's still a difficult life for a lot of people. I've been very lucky, but it is amazing watching all the technological changes.
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult journey that you just described to us. And that really makes me think about not just the medical care, but emotionally and socially, Gabe. What are some of the realities that you had to face as a child and going into adulthood with the emotional and social impact of your chronic illness?
Yeah, so I guess socially it was a lot different for me as a kid compared to the normal kid, because living with hemophilia, which is this blood disorder, you're more likely to bleed. You don't really have a lot of the same activities that most people have. So I was kind of limited with my friends. I predominantly swam throughout middle school, high school, and college. And this swimming was able to build muscle around my joints. And the reason you want to build muscle around your joints is because those are the targets for the bleeds. And when you get a bleed in your joints, that is like the worst case scenario, or not the worst case scenario, but it's a really bad thing to happen to you because those recovery times are so long. I remember I was in the hospital for a month or month and a half for my hip joint bleed, and this one when I was in like 8th grade or something, and I just remember missing like a whole month and a half of school because as a result of this. And so socially, I was limited in my friend selection because my parents and just like my healthcare providers wanted me to swim all the time. So I swam 6 days a week, and really the only friends that I made were on the swim team. I wouldn't so much as be allowed to hang out with other people in high school or in middle school, just because of the off chance that something goes wrong. I remember just living in this fragile lifestyle, and it was even the teachers. I remember in middle school, I wasn't allowed to play or join in any PE because there was fear that I would injure myself and the school would get sued. And also, I remember growing up really young where I would have to have a helmet on my head all the time for fear of bumping into something and leading to some intracranial bleeding. So overall, my social experience with hemophilia was that of being seen as fragile. I remember I wanted to skateboard. That's like, there's nothing more in my life that I wanted to do when I was young than skateboarding. I thought it was so cool, but part of it is because you want to do something so bad, but you can't do it, which makes you want to do it even more. So with skateboarding, I really wanted, I liked the style, like everything about it, but I was limited in that, more likely to get an injury from it. So I had to sacrifice that, and not even just skateboarding. Most contact sports, I wasn't allowed to go into. But in addition to that, I remember my parents were really, really scared for our health. that there was one year where we ended up all just being homeschooled to prevent us from getting in any sort of injuries. And this sort of lifestyle where I'm not talking to, the general student body and friends, I wasn't able to make as many friends. Kind of just made me become more introverted. So this is kind of, I guess, what the impact was with hemophilia in childhood.
So for either one of you that wants to answer this, listen to your stories. I see a lot of similarities where you had to be very careful about your life choices, and the opportunities were limited for you on how to be able to interact with other kids your age. If you could give one piece of advice to a young child living with chronic illness, whether it's the same one that you had or a different one, how would you advise them to find a way to maintain their morale and to keep going and to not give up hope?
Yeah, we talked about this a fair amount, and I don't know if I think it's any different being a child and being an adult. I mean, what Gabe just described, and we talked about this over and over again, when you're sick as a kid, all you want to do is be normal. You just want to be a kid. When we and Gabe were first talking, and he was talking about how he wanted to, he was in the hospital for that month, and someone had asked him, like, and he was like, and I remember being really upset that I missed swimming practice. And it's hilarious. You think you're going to be really upset because you're hurting real bad, but he's really upset because he's missing swim practice. And so for those surrounding a kid, as far as the best way to keep their morale up, I think Gabe and I would agree wholeheartedly, do everything in your power to create as normal childhood as possible. And this is something that both of us saw a lot as we were growing up, is people pulling their kids out of school, other kids that we were around, people, acting as if their kids were very fragile, which they are. And so that was understandable. But all of this pulls you out of being a normal kid. And you used the word that means everything, and that is hope. And this is the part that I don't think differs from childhood to adulthood, which is, I use sort of the word hope and dreams interchangeably, and they change radically. But as a kid and as an adult around a kid, make sure that they have a dream or that they have a hope. And it can be anything. It's not going to be, I want to be president or something. Probably it might be, I want to be a fireman, but it's going to be maybe like, I want to make it till Christmas. I want to get a Nintendo, whatever the thing is. If you're living for something, if you have a goal in mind, you can get through anything. If you're not constantly told, and Gabe and I were hammered with this in our families, you're normal. This is just a thing that has happened, that's part of your life. You were a normal kid. We were never pulled out of school. We missed a lot of school, but we weren't pulled. No, we didn't miss grades. We were, as much as possible, our parents had us, we didn't play necessarily, either of us, with other sick kids. We played with kids. And there were things we couldn't do, Gabe with skateboarding, but for the most part, I played soccer. That's the key. So the two keys, in answer to your question, are, and I think it's to a certain extent the important that your parents, because as a kid, your whole life is sort of dictated by parents. So in terms of how does a kid get through this, the first thing is dream. Have something that you're dreaming for or aiming for, and make sure that they have that. And the second thing is be as normal as possible, and just build that idea up in their head. This is just a thing that exists. They are normal. They can do anything anyone else can within reason, but they're normal and they're a kid, and let them be a kid. And if you're the kid, be a kid.
Yeah, I think that hope and normalcy are very important words. Gabe, do you have anything you want to add to that as to what advice you would give either to a child themselves or to their parent? Because I think when you're going through that at a young age, your parents are so important for building that structure for you.
Yeah, I mean, Erik pretty much touched on everything, but I guess I could just reemphasize how important it was to to be seen as being normal, even though you're not normal, which is kind of saying the opposite. But it's just, when you're a kid, you just want to be a kid. That's the extent of it. And the more that you're reminded that you're not normal, like the less kid-like you will feel. So it's important to find that balance and be able to give the child or live as if you're a normal kid.
You know that
I will add one thing to what Gabe said. Sorry about that. Gabe right now isn't just in med school. Gabe's at a top 25 med school. And the reason I mentioned that is because, and this goes to everything, like kind of what Gabe is talking about, he's not normal, but he sure acted like he believed he was normal. He, as a kid, was never told, all right, you know, you're going to be sick and this is going to happen and that's going to happen. That's a guy right there. And I'm pointing at the screen that you can't see, but that's a guy right there. I always do that. I point at the screen right there. So that's a guy right there who grew up thinking, I can be a doctor, which is something that a norm, like there was no limits. There was no, you're sick, so constrain yourself. That's a guy who believed he was normal and therefore could pursue the same normal dreams as everyone else.
I think that that's really important to look at this in terms of both of you seem like you were imbued with this belief that survival was not the end goal, that it was thriving was your end goal, that was where you were going. And that kind of leads us into a question that we got from the audience earlier about chronic pain and fatigue. You were talking earlier before we started about weariness. And what if chronic pain and fatigue is part of your experience? What are some of your tactics for continuing to return to a positive and hopeful outlook? Because not just from the childhood perspective, but from the adult perspective, you know, chronic pain is different from chronic fatigue. But I think from my personal experience, chronic pain creates fatigue and this general wearing down where it's like, you know, every day, like I have chronic migraines every day, and I also have chronic, you know, pain from some other issues. And it's, you know, it's just, these are hidden sort of invisible disabilities that I think a lot of times people don't see them very obviously. You don't walk around with a sign that says, I have my fourth kidney, or I'm a hemophiliac, or I have chronic migraines. So there are a lot of people, I think, that live with this chronic pain and fatigue, and no one sees them. And so how do you live with that? And how do you continue to rejuvenate yourself and continue your positive outlook? Who wants to go first?
I guess I can touch on the pain aspect of like chronicity, I guess. So living with hemophilia, you're exposed to pain, and the pain, if I were to describe it, is like, imagine a basketball hitting your finger, and it's like that pain that you get with it. But like locate that to different areas, like the hip or the ankle. And the thing about the pain is it's constant. It doesn't go away. You can sleep kind of dulls it because you're asleep. But it's one of the worst pains. The way that I was able to sort of combat this pain was the knowledge that so I have 3 brothers with this disease, and just knowing that they were able to go through something similar and come out the end of it in weeks to a month. I know that there's an end date to it, and I know that it's going to get better. And so just that knowledge kind of was enough for me to let my fears subside. And I know Erik and I were discussing this earlier. If Erik, if you wanted to add something about the fatigue portion.
Yeah, I mean, fatigue, and I know that Patricia has thoughts on this too.
Okay.
Fatigue is something that is, I've had chronic pain and I've had fatigue, and Patricia is absolutely correct. The worst part about the pain is that it makes you tired. But I've had fatigue on top of that. And the way, to me, far and away, fatigue outweighs pain any day. I feel like, and Gabe made a good point. If you, I can get through any amount of pain if there's an end date. If I know, and it might come back again, but if I know sometime in the next 2 weeks, this thing is going to end, I can get through that. Fatigue never ends. And the problem with that, like Patricia was saying, is the invisibility. And the way that I look at it, why it's so difficult, having lived with this my whole life, is you're in this world and you're navigating, everybody's navigating around everybody else. You know, you want to go to the movie. When is my schedule open up to go to the movie? You're all navigating. Your boss is navigating with you, your girlfriend, your husband, everybody's navigating around everybody else. And so you're going to have to amend things that you do based on something else that someone says. Pain, oftentimes, if it's not invisible, is something people can understand. If Gabe is in the hospital bleeding, if I'm in the hospital undergoing a transplant, I can talk to my boss about this, and they can go to a place, which is what everybody on earth does. Everybody, if you tell them this bad thing has happened to me, my mom has died, I've got, I flunked an exam, people go take their own life and they go, how did that feel to me? And then they say, aha, I understand how you're feeling. Fatigue is really tough because everybody, when they do that, will say to themselves, all right, what's the most tired I've ever been? I ran this marathon, and then the next couple days I slept. I know what you mean, man. I've been tired. I slept for 2 days. And then I got up and I went back to it. And so they're thinking in their head, you can get past this. But with chronic fatigue, you never, ever get past it. It's just always there. It's just like this place. It's like tiredness is geography. Like it's just this place that you live in. And that is problematic because going back to that navigation idea, people are thinking in their head, okay, I took a nap and I got past this. And it's also really rough on top of that because people don't judge you for pain. If you're getting an operation, they're not going to judge that. But if you're really tired, there's different types of tired. So when I'm exhausted, maybe I can't do work, but I could watch a movie because that requires a different part of the brain. But then if other people see you doing that, they think, hey, if you can watch a movie, why can't you go to work? Or some those kind of things. Because again, people are constantly climbing inside your body with their own experiences. And so exhaustion is invisible. Exhaustion is something that no one has any experience with, not really, who's not there. And exhaustion takes almost everything away from you so that when you try to enjoy various things, it's difficult because people are looking at you, well, you can do that, do this other thing that's a responsible thing. Now, the way that I get past that, which is how this whole question started, that sounded just very dark and deep. What I would say is the way that I get past that is I have to go back to what I said in the last question, which is hope in a dream. And we're going to get to this in some later questions, but my life and Gabe's life have been built around the knowledge, which is different than Patricia. Her life, she got the stuff as an adult. So her life, like this thing hit like a meteor later in life. But one of the advantages of being sick as a kid is you know this thing exists. So you can watch as you shape your life. So I've shaped my life around the knowledge that this is a thing that I have. So I've been able to develop dreams, first of all, and have hope and goals that I can aim for. And that, if that ever goes away, I've seen people die in a week once that goes away. That's the most important thing. You've got to keep that. But I've also personally had the advantage of building my life around that. So although it's harder as an adult, that is the thing. That's how I would answer that question, is the way that you deal with this is threefold. First of all, you have to understand and you have to sympathize with other people that they're not going to get what you're going through. And that's tough to get to that place. No one is going, people are going to understand my pain better than they're going to understand this fatigue. And that's just something that you have to sort of Zenist in a Zen type of way accept. And it's not people being bad. They're never going to understand that. And it's not because they're bad people. Right. The second thing is, oh, I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say the second thing is have a dream. And then the third thing, like I said, is develop an occupational life plan that is built knowing that this thing exists.
And those are all really great coping mechanisms. And I agree with you on all of them. We got a question in the chat that was asking me if I could talk a little bit about chronic pain that doesn't go away and how do we deal with that on a regular basis. And I think from my perspective, having chronic pain that doesn't go away. I mean, I'm sitting here right now with the migraine, actually, and you know, it's more of an emotional coping mechanism for myself on the emotional pain of the physical pain. Because as an adult, your description of having a meteor crash into my life and completely blow it up is pretty accurate, and then you find ways to deal with it. And how do I reach a point where emotionally I can maintain a positive outlook? Some days are more difficult than others. And for me, it was learning to treat myself the way that I would care for a friend of mine. Because I think that individually, we tend to always be harder on ourselves. How come I didn't do this? Or why aren't I living up to this standard? And how come I'm not able to continue these activities? And then, I really sort of emotionally and mentally flipped the switch in my mind. And I said, if my best friend or my son or a family member was living with the situation that I'm living with, would I berate them and say, come on, why aren't you able to do this? No, I would care for them. So for me, it was living with the chronic pain and finding a way to be emotionally and mentally hopeful was to treat myself like I was my own best friend and say, you know what, Patricia, it's okay. It hurts. It's terrible. You feel like garbage right now, but you know what? Put on your favorite aromatherapy candle and watch your cheesy TV show and pet your dog and know that tomorrow you're just gonna have another opportunity to find something good. So for me, that's how I maintain a daily balance on living with the emotional fatigue and the physical chronic pain and fatigue. So I think that if that was the advice I would give, I would, just tell people to be good to yourself and understand that even though sometimes you may feel trapped in your body that is not doing what you want it to do, that it is doing its best for you, and to appreciate it for everything that it's doing. And then sort of, I look at it as building a partnership myself. So that's the way that I approach that.
Can I say one quick comment?
Yeah,
this
go
is
ahead,
actually a quick
Erik.
one. Looking at that question, I want to just clarify one thing because I feel a little bit bad now. I want to clarify that when I talk about having hope or a dream, I don't mean hope that the pain will go away, because I understand that. I mean, there's never a day that I have migraines. I have had something like 30 operations. I have bones that in large extent have deteriorated when I was a child. So there's a lot of pain, and I don't have hope that the pain will go away. I know that it's like a constant companion. What I meant by hope is, okay, I've got this thing and I'm going to have to, it's just going to be there. But one of the things that helps me get through each day is the knowledge that I'm going to get this law degree. That's what I meant. Hope for something external.
Right.
So just wanted to clarify that real quick, like a dream or hope external to the life experience that I'm having.
Yeah, I agree. I think that having something that you can focus on and work to is really is a good way to move outside of the situation that you might find yourself in. And I think that kind of brings us to one of the things that we were talking about earlier was, how do you transition into moving from your childhood experiences into an adult? So you both have had hopes and goals that you've set for yourselves as young people, and you're manifesting them now as adults. Let's talk a little bit about how your chronic illness has affected your decision making on your occupations, where you wanted to go to school. Gabe, you're at a medical school. What are some of the experiences that led you to choosing the school that you wanted to go to? Erik, you want to address that?
You know what, actually, I'm going to toss this one over to Gabe in terms of like what sort of, I know like what sort of things went into decisions about occupation and where he's going to go to school and everything else? Because I think that he has a really good answer for this.
Yeah, I, when considering different medical schools and just future employments, one of the biggest things that have worried me is just the fact that the medication right now for hemophilia is incredibly expensive. This happened to my dad, where my dad was working at a university and he ended up being let go because 4 out of the 6 kids have hemophilia, and the health insurance that was required didn't end up, it ended up being too expensive. And so they just let my father go. And so we were unemployed or he was unemployed for a bit. But so that's something I need to consider, is whether my future employer is going to think that this medication is way too expensive and they're not going to hire me. Coming over here to Cleveland, I remember the health insurance that they offered here was a little bit different than the one that I got in California. In California, it was like completely covered. But then coming over here, they covered 95% of it. So, you're thinking a $300,000 per month drug supply, and only 95% of it is getting covered. So that means $17,000 out of pocket that I have to pay as, a student. I don't have that kind of money. So I needed to figure out different resources and ways to handle these issues. And fortunately I was able to do that. But I don't know if this is going to be guaranteed for me down the line, if these resources are going to be available to me. So that was something that I had to consider when thinking about, universities to go to, as well as just future employment.
What about you, Erik? You mentioned that you started working in a writing career and then transitioned into law. Did your chronic illness sort of shape the path that you took on making those decisions about what type of career you wanted to go into?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was thinking about this oddly from the time that I was in high school. I know that with my illness, I hope that what I'm about to say isn't true. There's always a possibility each single transplant I get that this isn't true, but I am going to need to shut down every 8 years or so, go on dialysis for about 2 years. At that point, nothing is possible career-wise. You just can't. And move and then try to re-enter the workforce and sort of start over every 8 years. As an adult, I'm going to have to do that unless the kidney, they develop a treatment or something. So knowing that as a kid, I was constantly thinking multiple things that I wasn't going to be able to do. One of these hit in law school. When I was in law school, there's this thing called moot court, which is basically you argue a case in front of a real judge. And it's the law school equivalent of the football team, which tells you something about law students. But I was really good at this. And I ended up being in this one competition second in the world. And I loved this. And it's all about being in a courtroom and arguing. And I knew that I couldn't do that as a career. I was never going to be able to be a litigator, because litigators, when they enter the workforce, have to work 60, 80-hour, 90-hour work weeks. I was never going to have that luxury, especially not, in the way from 9 till 9. I mean, maybe I wake up at 2 a.m. I wasn't going to be able to do that. I wasn't going to be able to do that for 10 years or so, which is what's required in order to get, the good cases and stuff. And so as much as I loved that, I wasn't going to be able to do that. So I was constantly thinking the following: what could I do from home? What could I do where I'm not going to have to worry about a boss constantly being like, no, you have to be here at 9 a.m. What can I do where I could get insurance? What can I do where prior to getting the insurance, I can be poor enough that I can actually get insurance through sort of like there's this gap. Like I need to be able to have an occupation where I get insurance because I'm so poor, I'm making nothing, but then instantaneously I'm making enough that now I can afford insurance on my own. So all of these things were constantly on my mind. And they absolutely were why I chose the two sort of career paths that I had chosen. The first one, screenwriting, fits that to a T. I could do it at home. I could do it whenever I was awake, even if I was on dialysis and I had woke up at 4 a.m. and had a few hours of energy, I could do it. I could do it at a computer, and I'm making nothing until I'm making a lot. So it fit perfectly. The problem with that as a career as it went on is I had a little bit too long where I was making nothing. So then I thought about the backup career, and I thought patent law is what I would do, because to be a patent lawyer, you have to have an engineering degree. I have a master's in genetics. You have to have a law degree, and no one understands what you're doing. So you're just sort of like left off on your own. And so that fit perfectly. And I started my own firm. I wasn't able to like I knew because of the things that I said before, I wasn't able to. So all of this, and again, I want to sort of punt back to you and say, this was a luxury that I had because it didn't hit me like a meteor as an adult. You know, I was planning this kind of stuff from the time I was in high school. And so, you know, I'd be intrigued how this idea sort of went in your life, because you weren't able to sort of plan things around.
No, I wasn't. Actually, I am a litigator, and I'm a patent litigator. And I was right in the middle of some serious high stakes patent litigation. And yeah, the 12-hour days can be a reality in this type of field. Like that it's not all the time right now, but yeah, it was really difficult. I think I mentioned earlier that it was really hard when this all happened, that we were in a really busy time, and I was going through a lot of stress and fatigue. And I mentioned earlier, there were some days, a lot of them, where I would go and sleep in the back of my SUV at lunch outside of my building. So I would have enough energy to make it through the rest of the day, or to even drive home at the end of my workday, and just trying to hold on. I guess if I knew that I was going to be in this situation, I probably would have chosen a different career besides patent litigation. But I was already in that career and I liked it. So for me, it's been more of finding ways to accommodate what I needed at the time. And, you know, we had an audience panel question that came in about, what if you are disabled? How do you get the ball rolling on accommodations with your employment? And for me, I can only speak to what Thermo Fisher has in place. And I was able to connect with our HR department, and they put me in touch with accommodations. We have an accommodations group within HR. And so for me, this was like 5 years ago where I really needed to start this. And I was able to get accommodations, you know, because fluorescent lighting triggers my migraines. Computer screens, being in front of the computer all day makes the migraine worse. So working with the accommodations team, we were able to get, you know, the lighting changed above my workstation, and, you know, just working with my manager to shift my work schedule so I could come in earlier and leave a little bit earlier and not have to deal with traffic, which was another external stimulus that could exacerbate things worse. So I would suggest for anybody that is got a chronic illness, and it doesn't have to be something as, you know, that we have, but there are varying levels of it, to reach out to your HR partner and start the conversation and say, you know, I would like to find out if there are any accommodations that are available to me. And you know, at Thermo Fisher, there's definitely a group, and most corporations now will have somebody in HR that can point you to an accommodations team. So that would be my suggestion on that. We had another audience question that came in about Gabe and Erik. How would you react knowing that scientists can prioritize research interests over clinical relevance? And I know, Gabe, particularly you going into the medical field, and Erik, you with your genetic background. How do you feel about that? And where do you see perhaps that the research leads into clinical relevance, and where is that balance?
Hey, you want to start with this one? It's funny because we actually had a discussion about this right before we got on. We saw this question and literally just talked about it. Do you want to start that, Gabe, or do you want me to? Or
I can try. So like, I understand the importance of research and creating novel ways to treat things is always important. Because let's say, for example, hemophilia, there's drugs on the market right now, like emicizumab or adynovate, which are, one's a monoclonal antibody and the other, adynovate, is a pegylated factor VIII protein. And I am approached all the time by pharmaceutical companies because they want to prescribe this medication to me. And I'm a little hesitant with it because, the research is, it's good, I think. I don't think there was anything wrong with it that I could see just from the few articles that I've seen. But it's, it's scary because the medication that I'm on right now has never failed me. And the only change that could happen would be that I would take my infusion. It's an IV push, the medication that I take. I would take that less frequently with these new drugs. So in my mind, I'm thinking that yes, research is important because you're making it more efficient in some ways to like take the medication. But at the same time, if it's not gonna, I guess, so much as change, if it has the potential to, or like the possibility of changing your like having an adverse reaction, it would be not worth it for me, in my opinion. So I would stick with the normal treatment. But it's just a really tough question. And I think, Erik, you had some better points to add here.
I don't know if they're better, but I mean, you basically, if I understand the question correctly, you have two different sides of research. And I think there are two sort of philosophies. And one is research for research's sake. Let's just do all the scientific research we can, and we're going to learn something. And that is important just because it's adding to the general knowledge, and that's great. Mm-hmm. I tend personally to fall on that side. But what I would answer to this question is I really want the following conversation to occur. And this is a perfect time to ask this question because almost exactly a year ago, all of us got hit with this nuclear bomb called COVID. And if you go back a year and 4 months, nobody on earth has heard of COVID-19. And yet we're about 4 months away from having mapped the genome, having figured out where it originated, having developed not one, but 3 vaccines. And so what that tells me is if we want to, and we focus, we can just take something that we know nothing about and be like, everybody, knock off all this side research you're doing and just focus on this. And in a year, we're going to have it cured. I mean, you could point to AIDS in a similar way. Once we got past all of the sort of racism that surrounded its initial or prejudice, discovery, from like 1990 through like 2010, we went from a death sentence to something. There's now commercials on the air talking about like, hey, you still want to make out with other people? Take this medicine. And that's amazing. And that is because as a world, we had tons of people focusing their energy. So if I'm sitting here with cancer and I'm hearing, hey, we've just given a ton of money to go research the 58th allele on the 10th strand of DNA in an armadillo to figure out why they get heartburn. I'm like, could we not do that? Could we devote some of that money and research back to cancer? And so I get both sides of it. I really do. And to me, the answer is, I would like people to be having this discussion. We live in a capitalist society. And so a lot of the times we err on the side of like, no, you have to figure out how this research is going to make money. But if we just do that, I think 98% of our research is going to be like, how do we deal with baldness? How do we deal with, like getting rid of fat so we can eat what we want? And then we don't worry about any other diseases out there or anything. So I would like to have some sort of middle ground, and at the very least have people going into this, having these discussions.
Well, we're getting close to our time. I want to ask a quick question for all of the caregivers that we may have watching right now, parents, extended family. Both of you have come through your situations from a young age. I don't think that either of you have children right now, but what would you say to people who are caregiving and parenting children who have chronic long-term disabilities? Do you have a piece of advice, any thoughts on, one, how do you rejuvenate yourself? And two, you talked a little bit about helping your children stay, from the child's point of view, maintain a normalcy to their life and not limiting their horizons. What else do you think would be a good part of that conversation?
Do you mean the caregivers, like for instance, if you're an adult and you have someone who, like a nurse that lives with you, is that
No,
you?
no. If you have a family member or because a lot of people are affected who have family members, maybe it's an aging adult, maybe it's a younger child that has a chronic or long-term disability, and they're caregiving for them. They're taking care of them, they're parenting them. So from that point of view, what do you see being a piece of advice that you would have for those people, either parents or somebody, because a lot of people are sort of in this sandwich generation. They may have a child with a long-term disability, and they may also have a parent now, an aging parent. So where do you find that balance, and what are your thoughts for those people?
This is a tough one for Gabe and I to discuss, because both Gabe and I think, are pretty confident that part of the reason we've been able to do okay is because we had parents who, let's be honest, they sacrificed everything for us. I mean, Gabe's dad had to worry about his career, had switched careers. We've both had a parent die at a young age. And part of me wonders, did this, worrying so much about us and everything else that went along with it contributed? So it's difficult for me to say, look, if you are a caregiver and you want someone that you're caring about to succeed, it's going to be a lot of work. And that's really hard for me to say, because I really look at my parents' life and I think they could have had a very different life. And so I don't know if I can answer that for them. What I will say, we were talking about, for instance, if you know someone else who's sick, like if you're the parent, for instance, of a kid who is not sick and they want to interact with other kids, or if you're someone who is, like, how do I deal with my child interacting in the world besides this whole normalcy thing? Because there are going to be people making judgments about them. And what I think both of us felt like is, it's tough. I think the tendency is to try, especially with a child, to shield them and wrap a cocoon around them. I think the tendency is someone who doesn't have a child who's sick, and you're talking about, there's a child who's sick over there, what do I tell my kid? I think the tendency is to say, go play with them, try to do that. And I think the tendency is, if you have a sick child, knowledge is power. So get that out there. And I have a different thought for all of these. If I was someone who had a kid and there was another sick kid, and my kid was like, I don't want to play with that kid because he's, take Gabe, he can't skateboard and I want to skateboard. You could go the route of saying, you should go skateboard with him, or you do something else with him. The problem with that is the kid's going to then see Gabe as a chore. Like, Gabe then becomes something unpleasant that his parent, it's brushing his teeth. Gabe is, you've got to go brush your teeth, this unpleasant thing. And that's tough. And that sticks with kids. And you don't want that. So if I was that parent, I would gently suggest, I want to go skateboarding. Well, hey, is there anything else you like? You like D&D. Does Gabe like D&D? And if the kid still objects, I probably wouldn't try to talk him into playing with Gabe. So I would be much more gentle about it than I think we instinctually would think. As far as when I was a kid, there was this program at the hospital that came into the school. And this program told the kids everything. And I thought it was so cool at that age. It told the kids all about, like, they brought all the equipment from dialysis. Like, here's the kidney that we use, and here's the needles and all of this stuff. And I got up and I showed my scars, and I thought it was really cool. Years later, I was still in school with some of these kids, and I'd had the transplant, and a lot of them told me, we were terrified of you. Like, we thought you would break if we touched you. And a lot of the kids apparently didn't want to play with me because they were terrified that they were going to break me. And so in retrospect, I think I would do what is necessary if I was caregiving someone to make sure that they're safe, but I wouldn't go further than that. I would, like, kids are going to, if a kid is naturally inquisitive and they want to know about what's going on with me, tell them, but, don't hide it. But I don't know if I would accentuate with kids that this person is different and this person is sick. And bringing that back to adulthood, I would say the same thing. And Gabe and I talked about, for instance, with dating, like, the kiss of death is to be looked at as different. I don't want to go into a job and have anyone think, and I thought about this all through college, I don't want anyone to think that's a kid who's going to graduate valedictorian. He's done really well for a sick kid. Given what he's had, he's done really well. And I don't want that at my job. Oh, that person, because then I'm worried my other coworkers are looking the same way. Oh, like Patricia's got this big case. They threw her a bone. And so it translates to life. You try to enter whatever realm of the world you're in, and you try to be as normal as you can. And if necessary, you inform people of what's you need to inform them. But that's really as far as I would go. And I would never try to coerce anyone into, and it's much more of an issue for a kid, but coerce anyone into interacting with me. I'm fun to interact with. And I think that'll come through as time goes on. And it's the same thing with any sort of caregiving situation, I think, is educate is necessary, but not to an extent where you paint someone as completely different.
I think that is a really good perspective to have. And, this is a great conversation that we've had today, Erik and Gabe. I want to thank both of you for coming on and being so open and so giving with your experiences and your time, and really helping people to explore the idea of chronic illness from a continuum of childhood to young adulthood to present. And again, I think that it's going to be a great conversation to continue with your podcast. I really look forward to being able to listen to it and see it. I'm sorry we didn't have any more time for audience questions, but we are over our time. Thank you so much to everybody who participated by watching, sending questions and information in the chat. And thank you on behalf of One Lambda, the Women's Employee Resource Group up there in LA, and the possAbilities Employee Resource Group at Thermo Fisher. And everybody have a great rest of your day. And